a blessing, not just to the nation of Israel, but to all nations. Jonah is waving his fist in the air and saying, God, I knew that you were like this. And if I went to those people who didn't know anything about you, who didn't know their left hand from their right hand, who didn't even know the evil that they were doing, and I knew if they repented, you'd forgive them. You'd forgive my enemies that want to destroy me. I can't have that, Lord. That's why I ran away. That's why I wouldn't go. I despise who you are in that way, God. Now, before we indict Jonah, we have to ask ourselves an important question. It's the question the book itself wants us to ask ourselves. Is there any of Jonah in me? You see, if I am not willing to go to my enemies, to deliver a message that might lead to their salvation, it is saying something about me. It's saying either, number one, I don't really believe in God's gracious forgiveness. I think that there is something in me that makes me and my people more worthy of God's forgiveness than my enemies. I don't really understand God's grace because I think it's because I'm an Israelite, because I'm part of those people, because I call myself a Christian. Somehow I got something that makes me have more of a right over God's mercy, grace, slow to anger, forgiveness than anyone else. Or it could be that I'm apathetic to my desperate need for grace. Because if I know how desperately I need the grace of God, that I can do absolutely nothing to save myself. And the very Lord who has every single right to hold every one of my sins against me has forgiven them all in his Son. That understanding ought to overwhelm me so much to the core of my being that I need to tell everyone, even my enemy. Let me try to illustrate this. Well, let me let someone else try to illustrate this. C.S. Lewis. I don't know if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's The Book, The Great Divorce. If you haven't, you have to. It is just a brilliant allegory. It is so fantastic. But let me just give you, so that this vignette makes a little bit of sense to you, let me explain to you the premise of the book. So The Great Divorce is an allegory, and the people in hell take a bus ride to the outskirts of heaven, where people from heaven can go to the outskirts of heaven, and there are certain people that are targeting these people who have come from hell to have a conversation with them. And the people that are in hell, because they're now in heaven, their bodies are like ghosts. They don't have the bodies of those people in heaven. Their bodies appear as ghosts. And there is one man who has come on this bus ride from hell to the outskirts of heaven. He's called the big man because on earth he was a big man, and now he appears to be a big ghost, so he's called a big ghost. And he is met by a man whose name is Len. And Len has murdered the big ghost's friend Jack while he was on earth. So the murderer from heaven is coming to visit the friend of the man who was murdered, the big ghost. They're on the outskirts of heaven. How might you think a conversation like that would go? This is how Lewis creatively does it. Well, I'll be, said the ghost. I'm going to try to do voices here. I'm not good at it, but I think it'll help with the reading, so just bear with me. Well, I'll be, said the ghost. I wouldn't have believed it. It's a fair knockout. It isn't right, Len, you know. What about poor Jack, eh? You look pretty pleased with yourself, but what I say is, what about poor Jack? He is here, said Len. You will meet him soon if you stay. But you murdered him. Of course I did, but it's all right now. All right, is it? All right for you, you mean? But what about the poor chap himself, laying cold and dead? But he isn't. I've told you, you will meet him soon. He sent you his love. Look at me now, said the ghost, slapping his chest. I gone straight all my life. I don't say I was a religious man. I don't say that I had no faults. Far from it. But I done my best all my life, see? I done my best by everyone. That's the sort of chap I was. I never asked for anything that wasn't mine by rights. If I wanted a drink, I paid for it. And if I took my wages, I done my job, see? That's the sort I was, and I don't care who knows it. It would be much better not to go on about that now. Who's going on? I'm not arguing. I'm just telling you the sort of chap I was, see? I'm asking for nothing but my rights. You may think you can put me down because you're dressed up like that, but I got to have my rights, same as you, see? Oh no, it's not that bad as that. I haven't gotten my rights, or I should not be here. You will not get yours either. You'll get something far better, never fear. That's just what I say. I haven't got my rights. I always done my best, and I never done nothing wrong. And what I don't see is why I should be put below a bloody murderer like you. I'm only telling you the sort of chap I am. I only want my rights. I'm not asking for anybody's bleeding charity. See what Jonah was saying throughout the entire book? I have a right to God's offer of forgiveness, but not those people. I will not tell the message. They don't have a right. The gospel says none of us have a right to salvation. No, not one of us. It's God's rich, gracious mercy, his slow to anger forgiveness. That's the only thing that gets us in. We're beginning to see here that the book of Jonah is no more really about Jonah than it was about the whale. It's really about you and me. It's about all of us. It's an invitation for us to explore our heart. You see, the last scene in the book of Jonah, and if you have the passage in front of you, it took me, I can't tell you how long of my life and how many reads of Jonah to figure this out. But the last scene of the book is not in chronological order. It does not follow verses 1 through 4 that precede it. It's a flashback. You see, in verses 1 through 4, Jonah had already waited the 40-some days until Nineveh would either receive calamity or the gracious forgiveness of Christ. That has already passed. But when we get to verse 5, we're flashing back. See, Jonah now in verse 5 to the end of the book, he has gone through the entire city. He has preached the message that God wanted him to, but the 40 days have not yet passed. There's weeks to go before that passes. So in this final scene, the author of the book is making a point. He's drilling the point of the entire book home with a flashback. It's Jonah as he is waiting to find out what will happen to Nineveh. And because this is a period of weeks, He needs shelter. He needs a place to stay. Now, we know from the archaeological information we have that outside of the city of Nineveh, there would not have been very good building materials. Maybe some dried up wood, maybe some brush, and maybe some stones. And Jonah would have used what he could to make himself some sort of booth, hoping that it would be enough to shelter him from the elements of what was a very hot, arid, and at times, as we see in the book, very windy part of the world. And as Jonah's waiting, the Lord produces a plant. This plant grows up. We don't know what kind of plant it is. It really does not matter. But whatever this plant was, if it was a vine, freestanding plant, whether it grew up the booth or whether it overtook the booth, it provided a superior level of coverage than his little weak booth ever could. It could guard him against the sun and the wind better than what he built could. And if you were there, and if you've ever been camping and bad elements, maybe a rainy day like today or something worse, you can appreciate a better shelter. So Jonah delighted in this plan. He loved the plan. It provided him all the shelter he needed as he waited and hoped, perhaps even prayed for God to destroy his enemies, hoping that his message would fail, that the Lord would not relent. He loved that plan. But as quickly as that plan came up, the Lord caused a worm or some creature that came and completely devoured the plant. The sun came out, a scorching east wind came up. The degrees and the environment kept going higher and higher. The sun beat down higher and higher. The wind was going more and more furiously. Jonah became faint, probably from sunstroke or something like that. Once again, Jonah wants to die, as he does so many times throughout the book. Was the Lord being cruel? Sometimes we think that the whale, I think Pete mentioned this, we think the whale is punishment, but actually no, the whale's not punishment for Jonah, it's deliverance, so he doesn't drown. The plant wasn't cruel. Destroying the plant wasn't cruel. No, destroying the plant was to teach Jonah a lesson he needed to learn. What was it really that prevented Jonah from loving the people of Nineveh like the Lord did? How inconsistent of Jonah to care so much about a single plant that he had nothing to do with it growing up. He didn't care for it. He didn't make it to grow. How inconsistent for him to care so much about one little plant, but then harbor such hatred in his heart against the city, a populated city with so many people that didn't even know better. How inconsistent of Jonah. See, one of the reasons that you and I do not love God as we ought to, and consequently don't love other people as we ought to, is because our hearts are prone to worship idols, created things. We much rather look to the gifts than the giver of the gifts. There was nothing wrong with Jonah loving and caring about his nation Israel, but if he loved the nation of Israel more than he loved God, his nation had become an idol. There was nothing wrong with Jonah appreciating and loving that plant that he had, but if he loved that plant that served his own purposes more than the people that God made in his image, he was worshiping an idol. Human love will never, ever be enough in this world. Human love, in and of itself, will always be tainted with their idol worship. We'll always be looking to people and things to give us what they can't. And the end of all idol worship, the ultimate end, is seen in this book. That eternal frustration of always looking to things that can never give us the fulfillment in life that we want them to give always ends with the desire to die. We become so frustrated with this world and that it is not giving us what we want to do, we'd rather die than live. What are your idols? Christians have idols too. We're all constantly battling against them. If you want to know what your idol is, you can simply ask yourself, what is the one thing in this world, if the Lord were to take it away from me, I'd walk away from him? If you can fill in that question, you'll be able to identify what your idol is. And boy, should we thank God whenever he brings the worms or vermins that eat away our idols. It's an opportunity to point us to something better, that our hearts would not be attached to the things of the world that can never give us what we really need, but they'd be attached to God. Because if we start loving God with all of our being, with all of our heart, we find out we can't actually do it until he loves us first. And because he has loved us despite all of our sin, there is nothing in this world, there's no person in this world that could ever hurt us so badly that we won't want to love them, because we've realized that whatever they've done to us is pale in comparison to what we've done to God and his creation and his people. And yet he gave us his son. Human love will never be genuine love until we receive the gracious forgiveness that he offers us. Yes, to Jonah as an Israelite, according to the shadows of his time, but we have the real substance of that shadow, his son, Jesus Christ. We know the substance. I want to end with another story. Let me make sure I get the facts right. You know the place that's now called Korea. It was not always what we know it to be today. It was as it is today, was prone to war, but different countries were fighting over it. It was a savage culture. It was a very stratified culture with some very few, very wealthy people and a whole lot of destitute people. They had never heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. Up to the 1800s, no one had ever gone there to preach the gospel. One of the first Protestant missionaries ever to try to go to Korea was a reverend named Robert J. Thomas. He was an American Presbyterian missionary shortly after the Civil War. And in one of his attempts to get get more inland into Korea, he boarded an American-owned merchant ship called the General Sherman. And the General Sherman was making its way up the Tai Tong River, doing what merchants do. And every time it made a stop, Reverend Thomas would go out and he would hand out Bibles and gospel tracts in all the ports that they would go. But the merchant sailors that he was traveling with at some point in the journey got into their idea that they would detain 5 Koreans. Word got out about this. And before you knew it, there along the Tai Tong River, thousands of Koreans lined the shores, shooting their flint guns at the sailors. They weren't able to hurt the sailors, but they decided, this doesn't seem like this is going to go well for us. Let's turn around and go home. So they begin making their way down the river, and sure enough, the ship, the General Sherman, gets grounded. And the Koreans take notice of this, and they say, this is our chance. So they get their fishing boats, and they pile on their fishing boats pine branches, and then they take iron chains and chain all the boats together so that they're kind of the width of the river. And when the water begins to rise in the river, they set the boats on fire, send them down the river. It overtakes the General Sherman. The entire ship is inflamed. And all the merchant sailors get off the ship and they start firing their superior pistols at the Koreans. Many people died. But what the Koreans remember, it's gone down through history, is there was one man on that ship who did not leave the boat with a pistol. He left the boat with a stack of books and tracts, gospel tracts in his hands. He shoved them into the hands of the people that he knew in just a moment were going to club him to death, which they did. Why such a sacrifice to the very people he knew that came at him with ill harm? See, Reverend Thomas knew that it was only by grace that he had been saved. He has no right to claim this grace for himself. And he wanted to share it with everyone he could share it with. Now, of course, the officials in Korea, they tried to burn all the Bibles that were distributed. This merchant ship really messed things up quite a bit. It was not good what they did. But some people concealed them because of this very unusual man who came when they were coming out to kill him and shoving books and tracts in their hands. This whole event stopped mission work in Korea for quite some time. But by the 1950s, along the Tai-Tong River, there formed 27 churches with 10,000 people attending. You see, he prepared the work for missionaries that would come later, because the people who concealed some of those Bibles began to gather together and read them and talk about it. We've been given a message of salvation. Who are we not to tell other people it? Who are we not to offer the very words of salvation to anybody we meet? We do not force it upon them. We simply go to them as people who have been forgiven by grace. And out of our deep love for other people, wanting them to receive those very same words, we go out to speak them as much as they will allow us to. We have no right to the forgiveness of God. It's purely been a gift. As Sinclair Ferguson once said, if God is concerned, can we remain unconcerned? I don't think so. We're going to be singing our song of response. It's a song called Facing a Task Unfinished. It was written by a worker of the inland mission to China at a time when persecution against Christians was at its height. It's been reworked a little bit, but that's where the original words come from. There's really only two reasons that we don't tell others the words that offer salvation. Number one, we think that we have something that makes us better than other people, that we have more of a right to them than other people. Or number two, we've just become so apathetic that we forgot how desperately we need this grace. And if we know how desperately we need this grace, it overwhelms us. It changes everything in our relation to other people, even our most heinous enemies. So please, as you're able, let us rise and sing